project is focused on, as Rupu said, on the values of nature and how that relates to stewardship in New York City green spaces. So I have our names up here, but of course also our partners' names with the folks that we've been working with and some of the students who actually are no longer students, they've all graduated, who helped us to collect some of the data last summer. So I'm going to start with just an overview of our project to kind of give you a sense of what we're thinking about in terms of the research aspect, and then mostly focus on how we've been thinking about building relationships with our partners and what our approach has been, and a little bit about what's worked and what hasn't, and where we've had some potential pitfalls. So I think that probably everyone is aware that in order to promote nature's benefits in our green spaces, it really depends on the characteristics of those green spaces, how big they are, what is the ecological structure and function of them, what's the biodiversity that's there. All of those things are really important. And these are some images of some of the green spaces where we've been working in this project. But what we're really interested in this project is not just those ecological characteristics, but also how the values of people who engage in those spaces might influence the benefits that could be derived from those spaces. And those values can be really diverse. There can be intrinsic values, which are kind of the inherent values of nature that we have, but also instrumental values. These are nature's contributions to people, or sometimes we call them ecosystem services, and relational values. These are place-based relationships and care between nature and between people within a green space, for example. But what we don't fully understand is how those values differ among individuals and among communities, whether we know they're not normally singular. You don't only hold one value, you often hold multiple values, and there's a lot of overlap, hence the Venn diagram here. And they're not always positive. Sometimes they're negative. There might be disvalues of nature. And so we're interested in how these different types of values and the potential disvalues also impact people's ability and interest and capacity in participating in stewardship, managing green spaces, engaging in the green spaces that exist. And so the question that we asked is, how do these values and disvalues of nature vary across these different contexts? And how does that influence stewardship? And we're doing that. We asked this question in conversation with our partners, with the collaborators who are community-based organizations and green space managers of these different parks. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about all three of them, but just to say we're working with Riverside Park Conservancy, the New York Restoration Project, and behind that gray bar over there is Solar One, is the other group that we're working with, who is based in Sty Cove. They're the green space managers of Sty Cove Park. And Rupu asked us to talk, sorry, trying to get a slide change here, a little bit about what impact means in our project. And Megan and Melon and I had a long conversation about this because it's an important question and it's not easily answered. So we tried to take a step back and say, what does impact mean in our project? And to highlight that actually, for us, impact is really defined by our partners. It's based on their needs and their priorities. And so while we had the idea going in that the findings of our research and this collaboration could be used to leverage, could be leveraged to support decision-making in green spaces, actually, it's really dependent on what our partners need. And that can vary across our partners at different scales, different timelines of needs. And so it doesn't look the same for all of our partners. And the other thing that we reflected on is that it's really difficult to measure. Excuse me, it's not just about specific products and outputs, but it is a lot of relationship building, and that impact in particular and the capacity building that happens is it's a challenge to measure it and to quantify it and say exactly what it means. But what we're doing in practice, to kind of try to put this a little bit more tangibly about what we're doing in practice, as I said, the thing that we said in our proposal is that our impact will be to leverage the findings to support stewardship and management in these green spaces with our partners. But what we're actually doing and kind of what we're thinking about is this relationship building and mutual learning that's happening. And that is happening through two-way communication, not just among ourselves and our partners, but we're trying to create kind of a community of practice with our partners so that the organizations can also speak to each other without us, and also some engagement and dialogue with the community members that they are that they're working for and that they're serving in their green spaces. We heard a lot from our partners that they want more opportunities to hear from the community members. They hear from the usual suspects, but they don't always hear from the non-usual suspects, the people who aren't the loudest voices in the room. And so this is an opportunity for that mutual learning to occur. Another form of impact is building evidence. So through the research and the data that we've been collecting, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, it offers an opportunity to validate and sometimes update the engagement and management practices and stewardship practices that's happening in these green spaces. And then finally, the last kind of impact that we've been thinking about is training students and building capacity in the field. Megan and I reflected on the fact that as graduate students, when we were graduate students, we weren't trained in how to do this and how to engage with community-based partners, how to do it well and effectively. And so having the opportunity to work with Malin and other students and engage with all of you who are at maybe an earlier stage in your careers is actually very important to us. So we're happy to have this opportunity. Maybe I'll pause for a second. Megan, do you want to add anything before I move on?
You're doing a great job. Keep it up.
Okay. So we then were asked also to talk a little bit about how we develop the relationships with our partners. And so the two of our partners with Riverside Park Conservancy and New York Restoration Project, those we had some initial contacts already within the organization. Megan had a personal contact at Riverside Park Conservancy that she just happened to know based on shared office space. Years prior to this collaboration, and I had an ongoing working relationship with somebody at NYRP. And so based on those kind of prior research partnerships and trying to remain in good communication, being really adaptable and starting with some aligned priorities, which I'll talk about in a second, we've had some pretty good partner relationships. And I'm going to talk a lot more about developing these relationships. But I just wanted to say for Solar One, that started in a different way for us. We didn't know anybody at Solar One, and in fact, Rupu put us in contact with somebody else from a different organization who we thought maybe would be a potential partner and want to engage in the project. And they didn't have the capacity, it wasn't the right fit at the right time, but they recommended that we reach out to somebody at Solar One. So it was kind of through that shared connection that we learned about them. We learned about the work that they're doing, and they became interested. And so then for all of these sites, we had site visits where we went and talked to them in person and did kind of tours around the site and have some ongoing dialogue. But just to note that at Solar One, we've had a little bit more challenge because there's been staff turnover. It's a small organization. They don't have a lot of funding. And it has led to, needing to rebuild relationships, which just creates a little bit slower of a time frame in terms of how things progress. But we're doing just fine. But just to say that has been a challenge. And we kind of we put this together to show the relationship with partners, where we started at the top with some research ideas, but we, with an understanding of what was already happening in these spaces. And then we learned about our partners' priorities. We developed some methods to address our needs and their needs. We revised and implemented and shared data, and it's kind of this iterative cycle, but it's very much not a linear process, right? There's a lot of back and forth that's happening across the board and in all the different ways. So, we make it look like it's easy and it happened very linearly, but it really was not that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we continue through the presentation here. So we just wanted to highlight what are some of the things that we learned from our partners and what their ongoing work is and their priorities, what their priorities are. For Riverside, they were really excited to engage with us because they wanted to learn more, and they were trying to put more effort into learning what's happening in Northern Riverside Park and how can they increase stewardship and engagement there. That part of the park tends to receive fewer resources, fewer volunteer hours than in the southern part of Riverside Park. And it's hard to read in the pictures here, but basically the bottom picture says it's from the southern part of the park. It says that these dedicated and slightly obsessed volunteers are working in this space. So highlighting there's just a lot of energy in the southern part of the park. But in the northern part of the park, the picture says, we don't quite have enough resources, but we're doing as much as we can. So they're highlighting they know that there's this challenge and this disparity between the southern part and the northern part of the park. And they're really interested in learning how can they get people more engaged in the northern part of the park? They also have a reforestation project that they're working on and some other things around waterfront access and safety that are of important priorities and concerns for them. For NYRP, and you'll see across these three organizations, they actually have a lot of shared priorities that they're working on. Again, waterfront access and safety. They have their own version of a restoration project. In this case, the Sherman Creek Living Shoreline, which you can see in the bottom picture there that they're working on, and they're trying to engage community in and helping them to understand what it is, why they're doing it, and getting people engaged in participating in the stewardship of that space. But then part of NYRP's working area is also Highbridge Park, which is a little bit disconnected from the river. And they're interested there in thinking about and understanding how the shift in the community, especially given changing zoning laws and gentrification that's starting to happen there, how that impacts the value of that space and how that those changing values will impact what people want and how they use that space. So that's something that we've been thinking about in the NYRP sites. And with our Solar One partners, this park is part of the Lower East Side redevelopment project. The park literally just opened like weeks before we started doing surveys there. And so it's a very newly developed park. There's a lot of concrete, as you can see. It's quite small also. And so they're interested in re-engaging community in park stewardship and the Solar One initiatives because Solar One has a beautiful new building there. And getting folks to understand and engage with the vegetation management, the waterfront access, and again, issues around safety, et cetera. So all of these things led us to put together a series of methods that could help us to kind of dig into the needs of our partners, but also think about the different values, which again, going back to our research interests is kind of key for us. So we did a series of interviews and observations in all of our green spaces last summer where we asked about connections to nature, values and disvalues, stewardship participation, and also a series of ethnographic observations in those spaces to learn about what people are doing when we're not talking to them and interrupting their day. And then more recently, in May, we took that data and our ongoing conversations with our partners and developed a series of community workshops. And these workshops had 4 interactive activities. The activities were the same in all the workshops and all the green spaces, but they were tailored to those specific spaces where we dug into people's interests and understanding about waterfront access and what kind of waterfront features were desirable to them, about stewardship and management practices in those spaces and whose responsibility it is to do what kind of stewardship, values and disvalues of nature, of course, kind of had a fun bingo game that people participated in. And then activity focused on restoration and reforestation and trying to understand what people liked about it, what was the thing that they were concerned about, what was the thing that they valued most about it, so that our partners who are actively working on these initiatives could take that back and start to implement it and based on what the community's perspective was. So I'll pause again. Megan, do you want to add anything? It's kind of a breaking point now. Okay. So I'm going to spend the next several slides talking about our long-term horizon and kind of the nonlinear process of our approach to relationship building. And I've got 6 points here. They sound like they're distinct, but in fact, you'll see that they're all very overlapping. They're very not distinct. There's a lot of connection here, but we're trying to think about how to distill it down into some important things that we found in our work. And I'm excited to hear also what Katie and Robin find in their work and the overlaps also. So the first thing is just the logistics and the getting started part, which in some ways can be the hardest because it feels kind of daunting. So we were thinking, when we do this, starting early with an introduction and as early as possible is important because it is a very long-term investment to build these relationships and get folks on board and agree on what you're working on. And so it isn't something that you can jump into and expect to be collecting data the next day. And it takes a lot of time to listen and learn about your partner's priorities and needs, but also going in with some negotiable goals and outcomes and expectations so that they can reflect on it and say, that will work for me, that won't work for me, this doesn't align with what we're doing, this does align with what we're doing, and there can be some back and forth. So allowing that adaptability is really important, but also being adaptable within the bounds of your own capacities, skills, and resources, which is not always easy. So I often overextend myself. I'm sure some other people are familiar with that. So, trying to pay attention to what is actually possible. And then also remembering that not every meeting and every partnership will come to fruition, and that's okay. But you're building a connection that might come back later, and be of support for you in the future in another project or in the future of that particular project. And then the other part of this getting started is thinking about what are some outcomes for that initial relationship building that can be concrete. So again, clear shared goals and expectations, that's probably obvious, but is being as operationalizable as possible so that you and your partners have something to be accountable for. And one thing that I really appreciated that HRF asked us to do was to create a signed agreement with our partners where we listed the expectations of what we were going to do and the expectations of what they were going to do, and we both signed it. So I think sometimes we don't always take that extra step to formalize it, but actually I find that has been, not that I've ever needed to refer to it or think about it, but just knowing that it's there and we have thoughtfully both agreed on it, has been really valuable in my opinion. And then following through, following up, whether it's just with the thank you email, obviously, but also, is kind of like a regular communication and following up with whatever those operationalizable next steps are is important. And then the other thing that I appreciate about our partnership with HRF is that they also value the importance of compensating our partner organizations for participating in this work because their time and expertise is of value, and time that they're spent working with us means time they're not doing something else. So we should compensate them for that. And it does create a little bit more accountability on all parts also that there is some, there's funding involved. So that's an important part of it. Regular engagement is important. These are some images of a kind of 2-page synthesis sheet that we put together after our interviews last summer. Melon put together. They were in English and in Spanish. So we shared them both with our partner organizations, but we also shared them with the participants who voluntarily shared their email addresses so they could see what the data represented and what some of the main takeaways were. And so that consistent communication, whether it's kind of a big output like sharing, excuse me, like sharing these 2-pagers, or whether it's just kind of small emails to check in. Sometimes we had scheduled meetings, sometimes we show up at events. All of those things help to create some open communication. Excuse me. We also have been trying to be very proactive about sharing documents and sharing drafts relatively early in the process so we can get feedback, and so that it's not that we're putting together a final product and then sharing it and it feels like there's not an opportunity to offer feedback. So we're sharing those things early. We're also sharing the raw data. So it's cleaned raw data. Melon did an amazing job of putting together like the raw data so they can see it. They can see all the various parts. They're not only their own data. And there's a lot of metadata to clearly explain what it all means so they can look at it on their own time. And then one of our partners asked us to think about a white paper. So that's something new that we have on our agenda that's coming out of kind of this regular engagement, is something that we might develop in partnership with them. Shared stakes is another important one. And here we were thinking about the idea that our partners really care about these spaces they work in. They work for mission-driven organizations. They care about the communities they're working for. And so it really is a benefit when you also care about that space. So developing some shared stakes that come from aligning goals and expectations through that regular engagement and mutual learning. Creating shared experiences and frames of reference can be really helpful so that you understand when they mentioned that the stairs on the northern part of Riverside Park that have been fenced off and are inaccessible to all the community, you get that. Like, you also have experienced the frustration of having to walk around an extra 10 minutes to get out of the park. So that kind of shared experience is really important, and it creates this vibe shift. When the research is driven by these shared values, there's some shared excitement on the work that you're doing together. That is important. I'm going to pause for a second also and ask Megan if you want to add anything to any of those slides so far or points. Yeah. Okay.
No, you're getting
Great.
everything.
And that those shared stakes lead to a positive feedback loop. So we're kind of building from maybe it's a shared.
You guys stole Harrison from our.
We didn't steal. We're only. Yeah. Well, so the example here that we wanted to share is that Harrison Nesbitt, who's the Riverside Park Conservancy, I think his title is Director of Sustainability, participated in the workshop that we held in Riverside Park and was explaining and engaging with the community about what they're doing with their sustainability related initiatives. And he was there listening to what community members were saying during the workshops. And so it was this kind of this shared research practice management kind of loop that was happening where they're excited, we're kind of like feeding into each other all of the ideas that are coming out of it. And it is this ground for reciprocal learning on both sides, on the research side and definitely on the practice management side as well. And it has resulted in some really fun kind of co-production and co-production, I mean, in like a way that we're actually doing it, not saying we're doing it, of like thinking about research and what are the outputs and how can we engage in these ideas together that everybody's excited about and everybody's benefiting from. But it is a long-term commitment. I've already said this. It's important to start early and to stick with it and spend the time working to build meaningful relationships with your partners and treating them and understanding them as colleagues and collaborators, not as outside institutions that you have to engage with. And, as much time as you can be in person is helpful. That's an obvious thing to say, but it is helpful to be in person and have those conversations and have some time informally to engage with folks as well. And then also we wanted to highlight here that sometimes it doesn't always work out. And sometimes you yourself will know the relationship doesn't feel right. It's not quite, it's too much tension. And that's also okay. And it's also okay to call it when it's not working out and to, shift gears or maybe find somebody else within the organization who might be a better fit for engaging in those conversations. But sticking with it, because also they're all busy. And I mean, like we're all busy, but they might not respond within the first week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, but it doesn't mean they're not interested. It just means folks are busy. And so, yeah, that's important. And then the final point that we want to make here is that this is really all building on work of a larger group of collaborators who exist within this space. And Megan and I have been super lucky to engage with our collaborators from the from the Urban Field Station, who's part of the U.S. Forest Service Urban Field Station, and the work that they've been doing to build partnerships with the Parks Department and these community-based organizations, and really kind of developing a rapport and trust among these different collaborators, and this kind of, we call it transdisciplinary ecosystem of the city and these community-based dialogues. And so, understanding that we aren't the first to do this work, we aren't the first to approach these organizations and ask them if we can collaborate. We're just one of many groups, and we hope that others will pick it up. All of you will pick it up after us and continue the work and thinking about how we can contribute to it, but just, understanding that we aren't the end all and be all of it. Megan, anything else here before I move on to the next section? No? Okay. So we wanted to highlight that it hasn't been all smooth sailing. There are missteps, there are challenges. I mentioned already that there's a danger in relying on a champion within an organization. For example, in Solar One, our initial partner, who was super enthusiastic and really engaged, and we had really wonderful conversations, and she really brought us into the fold at Solar One. She, her position, she decided to leave her position. And so then we hadn't yet established that same kind of relationship with other folks at Solar One. So as I said, we had to kind of take some time to rebuild the relationship and the understanding of what our goals were, even though we had the signed agreement and everything, which was helpful actually, because that was there. And so then there was some expectation that the collaboration would continue, but we had to rebuild a little bit. There also are sometimes unclear or different expectations and needs and what the timeline for products might be. And that is always a challenge. And I think that kind of fits in part with the third bullet here about the short-term nature of research funding and projects and academic positions, in which sometimes we as academics or in other positions, we'll change our positions or change our roles. And so we may not no longer have the funding or the capacity, or we may not be physically in the space to continue the engagement in the same way, or to continue the relationship building in the same way. And that, that is real. That is something that happens. And I think that it circles back to having really clear expectations and open communication with your partners about how that's happening. And then a challenge that we've had, and we'll come back to again, is just thinking of, and I've already said, is like thinking about how we assess our impact and what does impact really mean? What is impact, and how can we say whether or not we're being effective or successful in the work that we're doing? So our progress or our plan in using our findings is we were kind of thinking again about like, what does impact mean? And we've got some short-term progress and plans to use our findings. That includes the data synthesis and sharing that I already mentioned, but also some immediate changes in the park. And then we've got some midterm and long-term that I'm going to talk about in just a second. On a short-term scale, this happened in which we had our workshop with NYRP up around Sherman Creek. One of the activities that we had is we asked folks in the workshop to point out what they thought were desirable and undesirable characteristics of different waterfronts in our different green spaces that we're working in. And a lot of people at the NYRP and other workshops said, once they understood what was happening in this restoration project and why the fence was there, they were like, oh, okay, the fence is there. It makes sense why it's there, but why does it have to be orange? It's so ugly. And literally the next weekend, Jason went out and changed the color of the fence. He just got his team together. They put in a different fence. So that's an example of some like short-term immediate impact of the work, which we didn't expect. That wasn't necessarily something we had planned for, but amazing. And Jason was there and listening and heard what folks had to say. From a medium-term impact of our initiatives is, as I mentioned, Riverside Park Conservancy is working on the West Harlem Reforestation Project, and they were really interested in hearing about community benefits and concerns of the reforestation project. And so we organized one of the activities in the workshop around that in particular. And so they got a lot of feedback from, again, from folks who they don't normally get to talk to about what they thought about it. And by and large, people were pretty excited about the reforestation project and had far fewer concerns, I think, than they initially were, thought might be the case. And then in Sky Cove Park, as I said, it's a very new space. It's newly landscaped, and so they're thinking about the landscaping and the garden maintenance and the stewardship of that space and how to re-engage people. And so we had, again, through our workshop, had some ongoing conversations about those spaces, and people expressed their, concern about the fences and that it made them feel like they couldn't access those spaces. And so our partners at Sky Cove, they heard that, and they're thinking about how they can redesign some of the fences, create new signage so people understand where they can go and where they can't go, for example. So these are some of the more medium-term impacts of what we've been doing. And then long-term, I couldn't come up with some good pictures for this, so I highlighted in purple here. We heard from our partners, again, that they're interested in maybe a white paper to synthesize some of the takeaways from this work that they can share with policymakers or people who are making decisions for their spaces. They asked us if we can share our findings through community board presentations. So again, kind of a broader outreach and sharing. And then this idea that, ideally this work through these conversations and relationships lead to some advocacy and policy change. But that's a big picture goal, and we're kind of slowly working towards that. I don't have a specific thing to say yet about what that outcome will look like. And just finally to say, as I've already said, that our next steps is that Megan and I and Malin were constantly thinking about how we can improve our evaluation of short and long-term impacts of these transdisciplinary collaborations, and trying to think about what it means to be effective and what it means to have an impact. And so that's an ongoing conversation, and I wanted to highlight it here because it isn't something that we necessarily know fully what it means or how to do it the best. And so I look forward to hearing what other people are doing as well. And I think that is our last slide, just to say thanks for listening. Happy to answer questions. And I invite Megan and Malin also to jump in and answer questions as well.